At first, there was nothing dramatic about the silence, just unanswered calls, unread messages, and the uneasy sense that something was wrong. But inside one family's apartment in Nowon District, South Korea, the silence stretched too long. By the second day, worry had become fear, and friends asked police to check the home. Inside, the beam of a flashlight moved across a mother and her two adult daughters, motionless and bloodied from stab wounds. Then, in the stillness, one officer heard something. A faint rasp of breath. The victims found in that apartment were a woman in her 50s, who lived there with her two daughters, aged 24 and 22. They were by all accounts an ordinary, close-knit household. The older daughter was in her mid-20s, just embarking on adulthood. She was bright, sociable, and tech-savvy. Friends later described her as generous and kind-hearted, the sort of person who made others feel welcome. Her younger sister, only 22, was similarly warm and full of promise, still finding her path in life. The family's apartment was in Junggye-dong, a usually quiet part of Nowon District on the northern edge of Seoul. It is a dense residential area known for its apartment complexes and modest suburban feel. To understand what went wrong, investigators began looking into the family's recent history and relationships, in particular to a young man she had met through an online game. In South Korea, online gaming is a ubiquitous pastime, and it isn't unusual for people to form real friendships with teammates they only know virtually. The 24-year-old daughter had been an avid player of at least one multiplayer game, and sometime in the previous year, she struck up a friendship within the game with a fellow player, a man around her age named Kim Tae-hyun. At first, there was nothing alarming about this connection. Kim Tae-hyun, then 23 or 24, lived across the city. He was actually from the upscale Gangnam area in Seoul's south, but online those distances mean little. They chatted while playing, exchanged messages on Kakao Talk, the common Korean messaging app, and seemed to get along. She even did him small favors that only a genuinely good-natured friend might do. For instance, at one point, she paid part of the costs for an in-game purchase he wanted, a gesture to help him enjoy the game. To her, it was likely harmless generosity. But to Kim, that kindness meant much more. He interpreted her actions as signs of affection. In his mind, a romantic relationship was forming, even if she did not see it that way. As months went by, Kim grew increasingly attached. Eventually, the young woman agreed to meet him in person, cautiously, with some mutual acquaintances present. On January 23, 2021, she and two friends met Kim Tae-hyun for dinner and drinks. It was the first time she had seen him face to face. Whatever hopes Kim had, the evening did not go well. According to later testimony, Kim's behavior that night was erratic and unsettling. He was mostly quiet, but at one point he suddenly grew angry over a trivial matter, lashing out in a way that took everyone aback. The outburst alarmed the young woman and her friends. After that uncomfortable encounter, she made up her mind to distance herself from Kim. The very next day, January 24th, she sent him a firm message. She did not want any further contact, and she told him, in no uncertain terms, not to come near her or her home. Then she blocked him on her phone and social media. For Kim, this rejection was a breaking point. All of the warm feelings he had projected onto this online friendship curdled into anger and obsession. He refused to accept that she wanted nothing more to do with him. In the days following her cutoff, he attempted to get around her digital barricades by any means he could. He showed up at the young woman's apartment building in Nowon, despite her explicit warning to stay away. In fact, on January 24th, the same day she had told him off, Kim travelled to her address and loitered near her building into the evening, hoping for a chance to see her. It isn't clear if she even knew he was there that day, but neighbours would later recall a young man pacing around outside. Failing to confront her in person, Kim then turned to messaging through alternative channels, He used public payphones to call her, knowing his own number was blocked. He even persuaded at least one mutual acquaintance to send texts to her on his behalf. Nothing worked. She ignored or avoided every attempt. By January 25th, she went as far as changing her phone number entirely, severing the last tie between herself and Kim. At this time in early 2021, stalking in South Korea was not treated as a serious criminal matter. It fell under the category of a minor misdemeanor, continued harassment, punishable by at most a small fine equivalent to under $100. There were no strong legal tools for restraining a stalker, unless an overt threat or violence occurred. Perhaps partly for this reason, the young woman did not or could not easily get help from police when Kim began shadowing her. Instead, she relied on her own measures, blocking contact, warning him away, changing her number. She confided in friends that she was frightened by Kim's behavior. She mentioned that he had somehow found out her home address, even though she had never shared her exact apartment number with him. It was true. Kim had already obtained her address through underhanded means. Investigators later discovered that in an earlier conversation, she had once casually told him she was waiting for a package delivery, and even forwarded him a screenshot of a delivery tracking message. Unbeknownst to her, that image contained her full address. Kim had saved it. He knew precisely where she lived, and now he had shown up right at her doorstep. From January into February, Kim's obsession only deepened. Her continued silence seemed to infuriate him. At some point in February, Kim managed to contact the young woman through yet another channel, a chat application she rarely used, where she hadn't thought to block him. This time, his messages took a menacing turn. In one message laced with anger and sarcasm, he wrote, "I told you not to do something you'd regret. It's really a pity. Well then, live well." The phrasing in Korean is roughly the equivalent to, "Go on, have a nice life," delivered with an implicit threat. He also hurled insults and curses at her. It's unclear if she saw this barrage of messages or not. If she did, it must have only confirmed her worst fears about him. She continued to avoid any reply. For Kim, that was the final straw. It was around this time that he began seriously planning revenge. In early March, Kim set his plan into motion. He knew he needed more information to get close to his former friend again. Since she wouldn't answer him, he decided to deceive her. Kim created a fake online identity, possibly a new gaming account or another alias, and used it to approach the young woman discreetly. Pretending to be someone else, he managed to glean details about her daily routine. In particular, he found out when she worked and what hours she was likely to be out of the house. He learned, for example, that she typically returned home from her workplace late in the evening, after 11 p.m. That detail would prove crucial. Meanwhile, Kim started quietly assembling the tools and ingredients for his attack. He knew he had the element of surprise. The young woman believed she had successfully cut him off, and by now nearly 2 months had passed since their disastrous meeting. Perhaps she hoped he had given up. But Kim had not given up at all. He was scouring internet forums for ideas and methods. Investigators later found that about 1 week before the murders, Kim began searching online for terms related to killing and ambush tactics. He also began tracking the activities of the intended victim with disturbing focus. Police suspect he even followed her in person on a few occasions to confirm her work schedule and to observe the apartment from afar. All this preparation pointed to one conclusion. Kim wasn't plotting only to confront or frighten her. He was preparing to kill. And not only her. In statements he would eventually give to police, Kim admitted that he was prepared to eliminate anyone in the household who might stand in his way. He was aware that the 24-year-old lived with her family, her mother and younger sister. If they were present, Kim decided, they too would have to be silenced. He waited for what he deemed the right opportunity. That opportunity came on March 23, 2021, a Tuesday. In the late afternoon of that day, Kim Tae-hyun travelled from his home base all the way to Nowon district in the north. He carried with him a few critical items. One was a knife, a kitchen knife with a sharp, 6-inch blade that he had procured that very day. In fact, rather than buying the weapon and leaving a record, Kim had stolen it from a store. CCTV footage later showed him ducking into a supermarket earlier on March 23rd, lingering in the kitchenwares aisle, then pocketing a long knife when staff weren't looking. He also brought a disguise of sorts. He had decided to pose as a delivery man to get the family to open their door. To that end, he prepared a large empty box and may have worn a jacket, or carried an ID tag resembling those of courier services. He even packed a spare change of clothes in a bag, fresh clothing that he could change into after the murders, so that he wouldn't walk out covered in blood. Every detail had been considered. Kim Tae-hyun was leaving as little to chance as possible. By 5:35 p.m. on March 23rd, Kim arrived at the apartment building where the family lived. The older daughter, his primary target, was not home. She was still at work and would be for several more hours. This was exactly what Kim expected and desired. It meant the younger daughter was likely home alone. In the fading light of early evening, he slipped inside the building. He set his ruse in motion. Kim stood in front of the family's apartment and knocked firmly. Through the door, he announced that he had a delivery, a package to drop off. He even set down the box he'd brought, placing it conspicuously by the doorstep. Inside the apartment, the 22-year-old younger sister was indeed home, winding down her day. Hearing the knock and the word delivery, she was puzzled. No one in the family had mentioned expecting a package. Perhaps she thought a family member ordered something without telling the others, or a friend was sending a gift. In any case, she approached the door. After a moment's hesitation, the young woman unlatched the door to take a look. The instant the door cracked open, Kim made his move. He pushed his way through the threshold, shoving the door wide. The young woman barely had time to scream. Kim brandished the knife and had her at blade point in seconds. It was a horrific, one-sided confrontation. The 22-year-old sister was unarmed, cornered in her own entryway by a man she only dimly recognized, a former acquaintance of her sister's, now transformed into a threat. Kim showed no mercy. He set upon her with the knife, aiming for vital areas. The young woman was stabbed multiple times. Later forensic reports would indicate that the fatal wounds were to her neck. Within moments, she collapsed on the floor, bleeding heavily. It appears Kim killed her almost instantly. When it was over, the apartment fell silent again, save for Kim's own breathing. The younger sister's body lay in the front hall or living room area, lifeless. Kim was now alone in the flat with his first victim. There was still time before the others returned. He dragged the young woman's body out of immediate sight to ensure that when the next person came home, they wouldn't immediately see the bloodbath and raise an alarm. Then he waited. Somewhere in the apartment, a clock ticked through the minutes and hours. One can only imagine the unnatural stillness in those rooms, the only living person being the intruder, pacing or lurking in the darkening space, the television off, lights off, the only illumination the orange glow of evening through the windows. Kim Tae-hyun had several hours ahead of him, and a dreadful resolve to sustain. Shortly after 10 p.m., the next member of the family returned home. The mother came back that night unaware of anything amiss. She stepped off the elevator and walked to her door. The apartment was dark and quiet as she opened the front door. It's unclear what she noticed first. Perhaps the faint smell of blood in the air, or a glimpse of disarray inside. But before she could react, Kim attacked. He had been lying in wait, and as soon as the mother entered, he rushed at her with the knife. A struggle ensued in the narrow entryway. The mother had little chance to defend herself. Kim was younger, armed, and fueled by lethal intent. He stabbed her repeatedly, overpowering her within seconds. Like her younger daughter, she sustained fatal knife wounds and collapsed. It was sometime around 10:06 p.m., according to later records. Now 2 members of the family had been brutally slain. Kim did not stop. He simply waited again, with 2 bodies now lying in the apartment. Blood was smeared on the floors. The scene was growing ever more gruesome. Still he waited, because one person was left. The object of his obsession, the eldest daughter. She was the reason he was here, and she had yet to come home. One can only imagine what went through Kim's mind during that interval. Did he feel any horror or regret at what he had already done? Or was he single-mindedly focused on the final act of his plan? We do know that he took steps to prepare for her arrival. He moved the mother's body as well, into the same area as her younger daughter's, ensuring that when she stepped in, her initial attention would be on him rather than the horrific evidence around the corner. And he positioned himself, knife in hand, near the entrance once more. At around 11:30 p.m., the front door opened for the third time that night. The 24-year-old returned from her late shift at work. She stepped into the dim apartment, calling out a greeting to her mother or sister. Instead, she was met by an unimaginable sight. In the darkness, a figure lunged at her, Kim Tae-hyun. He was still wearing the clothes he had worn all day, now spattered with blood. He cornered her immediately, wielding his weapon. By this point, Kim's fixation had reached its zenith. Finally, he had in front of him the person he felt had wronged him and betrayed him by rejecting his advances. But before he dealt the final blow, he wanted something from her. Kim pressed the knife to her throat and issued a demand. She needed to hand over her smartphone and tell him the unlock code. Terror must have swept over the young woman. We do not know if she had already glimpsed the bodies of her mother or sister. Perhaps mercifully, he prevented her from seeing them clearly. In that adrenalized moment of shock, facing the man she had once considered a friend and now hardly recognized, she complied. She gave Kim the passcode pattern to unlock her phone. For Kim, this was one more element of control. With the phone unlocked, he tossed it aside for later use. There was no more reason to delay. He stabbed her again and again until she fell. The young woman who had tried so hard to escape this predator was now lying in the home she grew up in, bleeding to death on the floor. Kim Tae-hyun had murdered the last of his 3 targets. A profound silence descended on the apartment. It was shortly before midnight on March 23rd. By his design, no one outside those walls knew what had happened. Not yet. And Kim himself was now alone in the aftermath of his crime. What Kim did next only adds to the disturbing portrait of that night. He did not flee. The original plan had been to slip away. Recall that he had brought a change of clothes to avoid suspicion after leaving. He could have tried to disappear into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that, at least initially, might not immediately point to him. But something shifted in Kim's mind once the murders were done. Perhaps confronted with the reality of his deeds, he abandoned any notion of escape. Instead, he decided to stay in the apartment with the bodies of his victims. For the rest of that night and the entirety of the next day, March 24th, Kim remained inside the sealed crime scene. In the hours immediately after the killings, he took steps to cover his digital tracks. Using the passcode he had forced from the girl, he unlocked her smartphone, as well as a computer in the apartment, and accessed her online accounts. He systematically searched for any conversations or postings that mentioned him. On her social media and messaging apps, he deleted chat histories and even removed himself from her friends or contacts lists. It was a grim task, scrubbing traces of himself from the life of the woman he had just murdered. Perhaps he thought this might mislead investigators or buy him time. In any event, he carefully erased what he could. At some point, likely in the early morning hours of March 24th, Kim confronted what to do with himself. He had fulfilled his twisted objective, and now he apparently saw no future for himself. Sometime within that next day, Kim Tae-hyun attempted to take his own life. Using the same knife, or possibly another blade from the kitchen, he inflicted several wounds on his own body. Reports later described them as self-inflicted injuries that were severe. It's believed he may have slashed his wrists and perhaps even stabbed himself in the abdomen. However, his attempt failed to end his life. He collapsed from blood loss, but did not die. Kim lost consciousness for an unknown duration. Hours later, he awoke, weak and in pain, lying in the same living room where his victims lay. He was still alive, alone and unseen. Time passed slowly. Kim's wounds had left him lightheaded and dehydrated. In a bizarre detail that emerged later, Kim helped himself to some refreshments from the family's refrigerator as he lingered in the apartment. He opened a can of beer and also drank a container of juice or milk. Small acts of mundane self-care in the midst of absolute horror. He did not eat any food. There was nothing to do but wait, either for death or for discovery. I did nothing in particular, Kim would later tell investigators of those final hours. He simply drifted in and out of consciousness on the living room floor, surrounded by the bodies of the mother and daughters he had slain. While Kim remained in that macabre limbo, people outside were beginning to worry. The eldest daughter had friends who were accustomed to chatting with her, or at least seeing her active on social media. By March 24th, none of them had heard from her since the previous day. They initially assumed she was busy or that her phone was switched off. But by the next morning, genuine concern took hold. Calls to the mother and the younger sister also went unanswered. An entire family had seemingly gone silent. One close friend of the 24-year-old daughter decided to take action. By the afternoon of March 25th, roughly 48 hours since anyone had heard from the family, this friend contacted the police. They explained that their friend was uncharacteristically out of touch and that something might be wrong at the family's address. In South Korea, it's not uncommon to request a welfare check by police under such circumstances. Unfortunately, the authorities took the call seriously. That evening, 2 officers from the Seoul Nowon police station arrived at the apartment building on Yonggye-dong. It was just after nightfall on March 25th when they took the elevator up to the 10th floor. The hallway was quiet, and nothing seemed outwardly amiss. The officers knocked on the door of the family's unit. No answer. They called out, announcing themselves as police and asking anyone inside to respond. Still nothing. Concern growing, one officer tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. Carefully, they opened the door and stepped inside, flashlights cutting swaths of light into the dark interior. The officers soon stumbled upon a scene of absolute devastation. In the living room lay the bodies of 2 women, the mother and one of the daughters. A third body, the other daughter, was found a short distance away. Blood was everywhere. The victims had clearly been dead for some time, likely since the night of the 23rd. The air was heavy with the coppery smell of dried blood, and an eerie stillness pervaded the space. Seasoned as they were, the police officers must have felt a wave of horror at what they had found. Scanning the room, they discovered, to their astonishment, that there was a 4th person in the apartment, slumped against the wall. It was a young man. He was alive, but just barely. His clothes were soaked with blood, and gruesome wounds lacerated his wrists and body. The man was drifting in and out of consciousness, but as the officers approached, he mustered a few words. In a broken, gasping voice, he confessed then and there, "I did it." Emergency medical responders were summoned at once. The paramedics arrived and began treating the injured man, stabilizing him enough for transport. Kim, pale from blood loss and only semi-conscious, was carried out of the apartment on a stretcher. He was rushed under guard to a nearby hospital, where surgeons worked to save his life. In that moment, saving the suspect's life was necessary to eventually achieve justice. He needed to survive to face what he had done. As he was lifted into the ambulance, neighbors peeking from their doorways caught a glimpse, the figure of a young man, bloodied and handcuffed to the gurney, flanked by police. Few in the building could comprehend what had occurred until the news broke later. Back at the apartment, police secured the crime scene and began the grim task of forensic examination. The 3 women had clearly been stabbed to death. Investigators noted that the wounds, particularly the fatal cuts to the neck area, indicated a vicious attack aimed at killing swiftly. They recovered the likely murder weapon. A bloody kitchen knife was found discarded on the floor. There were also signs of the ploy Kim had used, an empty cardboard box near the entrance, of the kind used for parcel deliveries, which now seemed jarringly out of place amid the chaos. Scattered around were personal belongings and, poignantly, traces of ordinary life. A pair of shoes by the door, a shopping bag set down on a chair, as if the mother had just come in with groceries. These small details underlined the heartbreak of the scene. This was a normal family home, violently transformed into a slaughterhouse. News of the triple homicide in Nowon district spread rapidly through the police ranks and into the media. Multiple murders are rare in Seoul, and the fact that an entire family, a mother and 2 daughters, had been brutally killed behind closed doors shocked everyone. Almost immediately, speculation began about the motive. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Nothing significant appeared to be stolen, and the brutality was far beyond a burglary gone wrong. The presence of the surviving suspect pointed to something more personal. When word filtered out that the young man found at the scene had allegedly confessed, public curiosity intensified. Who was he, and why had he done this? Within hours after the discovery, detectives began piecing together the relationship between the victims and the suspect. It wasn't difficult. The friend who had called in the welfare check informed police about the stalking concerns. She mentioned that the eldest daughter had been afraid of a certain male acquaintance in recent months. From there, it all fell into place. The suspect was that same acquaintance. Police confirmed his identity from the identification he carried. A clear picture was emerging. This was a case of stalking that had escalated to triple murder. The public reaction was swift and intense. South Korea had seen violent stalking cases before, but the No-One murders were especially horrifying in their scale and cruelty. Within a day, on March 26th, an outraged citizen took to the official Blue House online petition portal, a site where Koreans can lodge petitions to the president and government, and started a plea. Please disclose the identity of the man in his 20s who murdered 3 family members in No-One. The petitioner argued that such a heinous crime by an alleged stalker should not be met with silence or privacy protections. In South Korea, police typically do not release a suspect's name or face to the public until certain conditions are met, to protect privacy and the presumption of innocence. But in extreme cases, a committee can decide to reveal the suspect's identity for public safety reasons. The No-One case, many felt, warranted full disclosure. Women are being murdered, and the world seems strangely quiet, the petition read. It should not be overlooked. This sentiment resonated widely. Within just a few days, over 100,000 people had signed the petition, surpassing the threshold requiring an official response. There was a wave of anger and sorrow flowing through online communities. People were horrified not only at the brutality of the crime, but at the fact that repeated stalking complaints, a known pattern leading up to it, had seemingly gone unaddressed by authorities in time to prevent tragedy. On social media and forums, messages poured in demanding justice, severely punish the murderer. This is clearly a misogynistic stalking crime, and don't let this monster hide, show his face. Amid this public outcry, police continued their work methodically. Kim Tae-hyun, after emergency surgery, remained in hospital under custody, recovering from his self-inflicted injuries. Investigators waited until doctors gave clearance to question him. In the meantime, they secured warrants to search his residence and seize his belongings for evidence. On March 30th, detectives searched Kim's small apartment room in Gangnam, combing for any materials that might relate to the planning of the crime: notes, computers, phones. They also began a digital forensic analysis of all devices found both at Kim's place and the victim's home. In total, they would analyze 16 electronic devices, phones, computers, tablets, to reconstruct communications and data around the incident. By early April, Kim had recovered enough to be moved from the hospital to police custody proper. On April 4th, he was brought before a judge for a pre-trial detention hearing to confirm the legality of his arrest and continued detention. The hearing was brief, around 20 minutes, given that Kim's involvement was undeniable. He offered little resistance. Investigators had already heard his initial confession at the scene, and once medically stable, Kim reportedly made a full admission of guilt during formal questioning. He detailed how he had met the girl through the online game, how he felt wronged by her rejection, and how he decided to kill her and anyone in her family who might interfere. On April 5th, the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency held a meeting to determine whether to publicly release Kim's identity, as the petition and public sentiment urged. They weighed the severity of the crime and the evidence of premeditation and decided on transparency. That day, authorities announced the suspect's name, age, and provided a photograph to the press. The photo showed Kim Tae-hyun, 24 years old, being escorted by police officers. He was gaunt and pale from his recent hospitalization. At the request of photographers, he briefly removed the medical mask from his face, revealing a countenance that was surprisingly ordinary. A young man with short black hair, looking downward, his expression blank and subdued. This image was splashed across news outlets with headlines referring to the No 1-3 mother-daughter murders and the stalking killer. The next morning, April 9th, Kim was formally transferred from police custody to the prosecutor's custody, a handover that in South Korea is often a public spectacle. As he was led out of the police station in front of reporters, they shouted questions at him. "Why did you do it? Do you have anything to say to the victim's family?" Kim, clad in prison garb and a mask, responded quietly, "I'm sorry." He said that he regretted his actions and that he would atone for his sins. It was a brief, muted apology, and many wondered if it was genuine remorse or simply a reflexive statement. For the victim's grieving relatives, whoever was left to hear it, those words surely rang hollow against the enormity of his deeds. By mid-April, prosecutors charged Kim with multiple offences. The indictment, filed on April 27th, listed 3 counts of murder, plus charges of special residence trespass and theft for stealing the kitchen knife from the store. Notably absent was any charge of stalking. Legally, at the time of the crime, stalking per se was not an indictable felony under which serious penalties could be pursued. Although Kim's entire motive and course of conduct centered on stalking behavior, prosecutors had no choice but to omit that angle in the formal charges, a point that was not lost on the public. The timing was cruelly ironic. On March 24th, 2021, literally one day after Kim committed the murders, the National Assembly in Seoul had finally passed a new anti-stalking law that would criminalize stalking as a serious offense. However, that law would not come into effect until later in the year, and it could not be applied retroactively to Kim's case. Nonetheless, prosecutors made it clear in their filings that Kim's actions were driven by a prolonged course of stalking and obsession. An official from the prosecutor's office described Kim's temperament as showing antisocial tendencies. In other words, a man with low empathy, extreme entitlement, and a capacity for violence when faced with rejection. They noted, however, that psychological tests indicated Kim was not a psychopath in the classical clinical sense. He did not meet that diagnostic profile. He was sane, aware, and deliberate, which in their eyes made his crimes all the more consciously cruel. One quiet day in early April, as police continued their investigation, residents of the No 1 apartment complex decided to pay their respects to the lost family. Outside the door of the apartment, where the 3 lives were taken, a small makeshift memorial sprang up. Someone laid a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the floor in front of the threshold. Next to the flowers, a plain white piece of paper was taped to the door. On it, handwritten in Korean, was a short message. "We are sorry. Please rest in peace, even in the sky." It was signed simply as from the neighbouring residents. As the case moved toward trial, it also moved the needle on legal reform. Public anger over stalking incidents had been mounting in South Korea, and this case became Exhibit A in the argument for urgency. Although a new anti-stalking law had been passed on paper, its effective date was set for October 2021. In the interim, victims remained vulnerable, and stalking behaviours were still often dismissed as lovers' quarrels or personal disputes. After the No 1 murders, police and legislators faced intense scrutiny. Why hadn't Kim Tae-hyun been stopped earlier? Did the victim ever try to seek help? Could a restraining order or any intervention have saved those 3 lives? These questions surfaced in newspapers and on television debates. In response, law enforcement agencies vowed to step up their handling of stalking complaints, even ahead of the new law's activation. And when the Anti-Stalking Act finally came into force in October 2021, it was partly in the shadow of this crime. The new law defined stalking clearly, repeated unwanted contact, following, or harassment, and raised the maximum penalty to 5 years in prison and fines up to 50 million won, around $42,000. It also allowed courts to issue restraining orders and for police to detain stalkers in urgent situations. Had these provisions existed and been applied in January 2021, perhaps, one hopes, Kim's escalation could have been detected and disrupted before it was too late. Kim Tae-hyun's trial began in the summer of 2021 at the Seoul Northern District Court. The proceedings riveted the nation. Here was a case that seemed open and shut in terms of guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, and the defendant had confessed. Yet it raised profound questions about motive, mental state, and punishment. The prosecution urged the judges to impose the harshest punishment available, the death penalty. It was a penalty seldom sought in South Korea, but prosecutors felt this case was among the rarest of rare that warranted it. This is a life that coldly took 3 other lives in a premeditated, cruel act, they argued. Society cannot afford the risk of ever letting him do this again. The defense faced an uphill battle. The evidence of guilt was incontrovertible, so their strategy focused on sparing him a death sentence. They claimed that Kim's primary plan had been to kill the eldest daughter. That much they conceded was planned, but that the murders of the other 2 women were, in their words, unintended outcomes. They suggested that he had panicked when he encountered the younger sister at home and then the mother, and that he killed them in a frenzy, not as part of a cold design. The implication was that those 2 killings might be considered less premeditated, perhaps akin to second-degree murder or manslaughter under extreme circumstances, rather than first-degree premeditated murder. It was a slender distinction, and the prosecution fiercely rejected it, pointing to the mountain of evidence of planning. Kim Tae-hyun himself spoke at his trial. When given the opportunity to address the court, he expressed remorse. In a quiet voice, he said, "I will regret this for the rest of my life. I will repent every day while I am alive." He apologized to the victim's surviving family, extended relatives, as no immediate family remained, and to the public for the terror and grief he caused. Observers in the court noted that Kim appeared gaunt and downcast, sometimes staring at the floor as gruesome details of his crimes were recounted. Whether his remorse was profound, or simply the self-pity of a man who ruined his own life, only he could truly know. But there was little sympathy to be found for him. 3 beloved people were gone forever, and nothing he said could undo that. On October 12, 2021, the 3-judge panel of the Seoul Northern District Court delivered their verdict and sentencing. The courtroom was tense as Judge Oh, the presiding judge, read the decision. Kim Tae-hyun was found guilty on all counts, the murders of all 3 victims, the charge of trespass, and the theft. The judges did not buy the defense argument that any part of the crime was unplanned or accidental. In their judgment, they noted that Kim had deliberately arrived early, knowing the eldest daughter would be away, which demonstrated clear intent to target the others. When it came to the sentence, however, the judges stopped short of acceding to the death penalty request. They sentenced Kim Tae-hyun to life imprisonment. The judges took into account that Kim had admitted most of the charges, sparing the need for a protracted denial or trial to prove guilt. They also considered sentencing fairness, an implicit reference to other notorious murder cases in which defendants had received life sentences rather than death. In recent decades, Korean courts have often opted for life terms rather than death even in multiple murder cases, unless there were truly exceptional circumstances. Additionally, the court subtly acknowledged the reality that a death sentence might only be symbolic, since executions are not being carried out. However, the life sentence came with a significant stipulation. The court ordered that Kim, if ever released on parole, must be subject to 30 years of electronic monitoring via an ankle bracelet. In fact, during sentencing, the judges made an unusual comment recommending that the Justice Ministry never permit Kim's release. It was a statement of moral condemnation, even if it had no binding legal force. Parole decisions are under the purview of the executive branch in the future. Kim Tae-hyun showed little visible reaction as his sentence was read. According to reporters in the courtroom, he stood with his head bowed. He was then led out of the courtroom, destined for the prison where he would begin serving his life term. Outside, some of the victims' relatives quietly wept at the conclusion of the trial. One family member of the victims told the press that, While they had hoped for a death sentence, they accepted the court's decision. "We just didn't want him to ever walk free again," a relative said. "As long as he is locked up forever, that's what matters."